In April 1942, the Pacific Ocean was still reeling from shock, and on the morning of April 18th, the gray surface north of Japan rolled beneath low clouds as Task Force 16 moved through heavy seas, its ships running without lights, radios mostly silent, every mile closing toward a line no American carrier force had ever crossed before. And on the flight deck of USS Hornet, 16 Army Air Force's B-25B Mitchell bombers sat lashed down where fighters should have been, their propellers locked, their crews already awake, the smell of fuel and salt mixing with tension that had been building since the task force departed Alameda weeks earlier, because this strike had no precedent, no rehearsal that truly matched what lay ahead, no certainty that any of the men involved would return. And at this moment, the plan still depended on remaining undetected for several more hours, long enough to reach the carefully calculated launch point that balanced fuel range, Japanese defenses, and the fragile arithmetic of distance across the western Pacific. Hornet was accompanied by USS Enterprise, whose air group provided combat air patrol, and by cruisers and destroyers stretched around them in a protective screen, all under the overall command of Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., whose orders from Admiral Chester Nimitz were clear in intent and flexible in execution, because success would depend less on doctrine than on judgment under pressure. And that pressure increased steadily as the task force pressed westward into waters where Japanese patrols were expected at any time.
While below decks, pilots and crews reviewed maps that showed only approximations of their targets, many of them trained only weeks earlier for a mission that broke every rule they had been taught, launching a twin-engine bomber from an aircraft carrier, flying at low altitude over enemy territory, and then continuing on to China with no expectation of returning to the fleet. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, selected to lead the raid not only for his rank, but for his reputation as a cool and technically precise aviator, moved quietly among the crews, checking details, reinforcing procedures, not delivering speeches, because this was not the moment for dramatics, and because every man already understood the stakes, understood that this strike was meant to answer Pearl Harbor, not with destruction on the scale Japan had delivered, but with proof that the United States could reach back across the ocean and strike the Japanese home islands themselves, a psychological objective that mattered as much as physical damage in a war whose outcome still felt uncertain in the spring of 1942. The B-25s had been stripped of unnecessary weight, fitted with extra fuel tanks, their defensive armament reduced or improvised, and their crews carefully selected for skill and adaptability. Yet none of that removed the fundamental risk, because the Mitchell had never been designed for carrier operations, and the margin for error during takeoff would be measured in feet, not yards.
With a cold Pacific waiting beyond the bow if an engine faltered or a pilot misjudged the wind, shortly after dawn, as light crept across the cloud cover, radar operators aboard Enterprise detected a contact ahead, small but distinct, and visual confirmation soon followed, a Japanese picket vessel, one of the fishing boats and patrol craft that formed an outer ring of early warning for the home islands. And in that instant, the careful timeline of the mission collapsed, because although the cruiser Nashville quickly opened fire and the destroyer Bouch moved in to finish the job, radio transmissions from the enemy vessel were believed to have been sent, and Halsey and Doolittle were forced to confront the central question of the raid under conditions they had hoped to avoid, whether to launch immediately from a point still hundreds of miles farther east than planned, or to turn away and abandon the mission entirely. The decision could not be deferred because remaining in the area increased the risk of air or submarine attack, and because delay offered no guarantee that the Japanese had not already been alerted. And so, after a brief exchange of signals, Halsey sent the message that would commit the strike: launching time now. And Doolittle acknowledged, understanding instantly what it meant for fuel calculations, for the prospects of reaching China, and for the likelihood that crews would have to bail out or crash land after completing their bombing runs. On Hornet's deck, the atmosphere shifted from waiting to action as crews ran through final checks, engines were warmed, chocks prepared, and the first aircraft was moved into position at the bow, the deck pitching and rolling as the carrier drove into the wind to maximize lift, while Enterprise maintained air patrol overhead, her fighters circling protectively in a sky that offered no cover if Japanese reconnaissance aircraft appeared. Doolittle's aircraft was first, not by chance, but by design, because the commander would set the example, and as his B-25 rolled forward to the very edge of the deck, the nose extending over open water, the distance available for takeoff was barely more than 450 feet, far shorter than any bomber crew would normally accept, yet months of planning and practice now condensed into seconds as engine power was brought up, brakes released, and the aircraft surged forward, lifting free of the deck and clearing the bow with room to spare but no excess, climbing slowly into the low cloud. And in that moment, the raid ceased to be a plan and became a reality. Because once the first bomber was airborne, there could be no turning back for the rest. One by one, the remaining B-25s followed, each takeoff watched by the deck crew with a mixture of concentration and relief, because any failure would not only cost lives, but could block the deck and imperil the ship. And as the last aircraft lifted away, Hornet's deck was suddenly empty, stripped of its unusual cargo, leaving behind only the knowledge that 16 American bombers were now headed alone toward Japan, without fighter escort, without the possibility of diversion, carrying modest bomb loads but enormous symbolic weight. The flight itself demanded constant attention because the crews flew low over the ocean to avoid detection, navigating by dead reckoning and limited radio aids, scanning the horizon for ships and the sky for patrol aircraft, knowing that interception by Japanese fighters would place them at a severe disadvantage, yet also knowing that climbing to higher altitude risked early detection. And as the coastline of Japan finally came into view through breaks in the cloud, the reality of the mission sharpened, because these were not abstract targets on a map, but industrial cities, docks, and military facilities that had not been bombed by enemy aircraft before. And although the damage inflicted would be limited by bomb size and accuracy, the act itself carried strategic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate explosions. Each crew had been assigned a target area, including Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokosuka, and as they approached, timing and coordination dissolved into individual execution, because the bombers arrived over Japan separately rather than in formation, some encountering light anti-aircraft fire, others none at all.
Japanese defenses caught off guard by the unexpected approach of medium bombers at low altitude, yet still reacting quickly enough to remind the crews that they were deep inside enemy territory, with no safe haven and no second chance. Bombs were released, photographed in some cases by onboard cameras, and then the aircraft turned south and west, away from Japan and toward the long overwater leg that would determine survival, because fuel consumption during the early launch and the low-altitude approach had already exceeded planning estimates, and weather conditions over the East China Sea were deteriorating, with headwinds and storms threatening to erase the narrow margin that remained. As daylight faded, the crews faced the most dangerous phase of the mission, flying into darkness over unfamiliar terrain with limited navigation aids and the constant calculation of whether fuel would last long enough to reach Chinese airfields that might or might not be ready to receive them.
because communication with Chinese forces had been constrained by secrecy and the realities of operating behind Japanese lines, and every additional mile flown increased the probability that the mission would end not on a runway, but in a field, a river, or the sea. Some crews realized before midnight that reaching their intended landing sites was impossible and prepared instead to bail out, choosing locations that offered at least the possibility of evasion and rescue, while others pressed on until engines sputtered or fuel gauges dropped to zero, the B-25s descending into darkness with no lights, guided only by instinct, experience, and fragments of moonlight breaking through cloud. And it was in these moments, long after the bombs had fallen, that the full cost of the early launch decision became apparent, because although the strike had succeeded in reaching Japan, it had done so at the expense of the carefully balanced recovery plan, turning what was already a dangerous mission into one that now depended heavily on luck, weather, and the willingness of local Chinese civilians and guerrilla forces to aid downed airmen despite the brutal reprisals they could expect from Japanese occupation troops. As dawn approached on April 19, scattered across eastern China, the outcomes of the raid began to resolve into individual stories of survival, capture, and loss, with most crews eventually rescued by Chinese allies, some interned by the Soviet Union after landing in Vladivostok, and others falling into Japanese hands. Yet at the moment the last aircraft disappeared into the night sky south of Japan, none of that was known to the men aboard the American carriers, now turning east at high speed, because from the deck of Hornet and the bridge of Enterprise, the raid ended not with triumph or clarity, but with absence. 16 aircraft gone, their fate uncertain, the strategic impact still unknowable, and the realization that the strike launched under extreme uncertainty had crossed a threshold in the Pacific War, provoking consequences that would soon ripple outward in ways no one aboard Task Force 16 could yet see. As the task force steamed away under radio silence, leaving behind an enemy alerted, embarrassed, and already beginning to respond, while across thousands of miles of ocean, the question remained unresolved whether the price paid for this moment would ultimately justify the risk that had been taken. That question began to acquire shape almost immediately in the hours after the American carriers turned east, because the Japanese response, still fragmented and confused at first, was already accelerating. And even as Task Force 16 increased speed to clear the danger area, reports were moving through Japanese naval and army channels confirming that enemy aircraft had struck multiple locations on the home islands, a development that cut directly against assumptions of security and distance that had shaped Japanese strategy since the opening of the war. And although the physical damage from the bombs was limited, the psychological effect was immediate and profound, forcing senior leaders in Tokyo to confront the fact that the perimeter established after Pearl Harbor was not impermeable, and that American carrier forces possessed both the reach and the audacity to operate far closer to Japan than previously believed. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, this realization intensified existing debates over how to draw out and destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, reinforcing arguments for decisive operations that would culminate only weeks later at Midway. But in the short term, it also triggered a surge in search activity across the Western Pacific, with submarines redeployed, aircraft sorties increased, and coastal patrols expanded. All of which meant that the withdrawal of Halsey's task force was not a quiet retreat, but a race against a tightening net, conducted under the constant risk that Japanese aircraft or submarines might locate the carriers before they reached safer waters. Aboard Enterprise and Hornet, watches were doubled, Radar operators remained alert for contact that might signal pursuit, and destroyers maneuvered aggressively to counter any hint of submarine presence, because the loss of either carrier at this stage of the war would have been catastrophic, not only in material terms, but in morale, erasing any symbolic gain achieved by the raid itself. Yet, as the task force pressed eastward, no immediate engagement materialized, and within days the ships were beyond the effective reach of Japanese air power, allowing commanders to turn their attention from immediate survival to the implications of what had been done. Implications that were still unfolding far from the carriers themselves, in China, in Japan, and within the American command structure, attempting to assess both cost and benefit under conditions of incomplete information. In eastern China, the arrival of American airmen triggered a rapid and often chaotic response among Chinese nationalist forces and local civilian networks,
many of whom had been forewarned in vague terms that American aircraft might appear, but were unprepared for the scale and urgency of the situation, as downed crews, exhausted and injured from crash landings or parachute descents, moved through unfamiliar terrain, relying on guides, interpreters, and improvised shelters to evade Japanese patrols that were already mobilizing in strength. The Japanese army, determined to punish both the raiders and those who assisted them, launched large-scale reprisals across several provinces, operations that resulted in widespread suffering among the civilian population, a consequence of the raid that American planners had anticipated only in abstract terms and could not influence once events were set in motion. And while these actions lay beyond the immediate scope of naval operations, they formed part of the broader escalation triggered by the strike, demonstrating how a brief air operation could produce enduring and severe effects across multiple theaters. For the American crews themselves, the days and weeks following the raid were defined by separation and uncertainty, as men who had trained together dispersed across internment camps, hospital wards, and improvised safe houses, with limited ability to communicate their status to U.S. authorities, leaving commanders and families alike to wait for confirmation that arrived slowly, often through indirect channels, reinforcing the sense that the raid's true outcome could not be measured quickly or easily. Within the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces, assessments of the raid reflected this uncertainty,
balancing recognition of its morale value against sober analysis of the risks taken, particularly the exposure of two precious carriers to potential counterattack, and the fact that the bombers themselves had been lost almost entirely, a price that would have been unacceptable under different strategic conditions, but was judged tolerable in the spring of 1942 because the United States possessed little else that could strike Japan directly at that time. Admiral Nimitz, overseeing the Pacific Theater from Pearl Harbor, understood that the raid's greatest impact lay not in immediate damage, but in its effect on Japanese decision-making, an effect that would only become clear as intelligence reports accumulated, and as intercepted communications and observed movements suggested that Japanese leaders were accelerating plans to extend their defensive perimeter eastward, setting in motion the chain of events that would bring the opposing fleets into collision at Midway, where the balance of naval power in the Pacific would hinge on decisions made under pressures very similar to those that had governed the Doolittle raid itself. Yet even as these strategic consequences began to take shape, the raid remained for many within the U.S. military an operation defined by unanswered questions, because the fate of several crews was still unknown, and because the secrecy that had surrounded the planning now limited what could be publicly acknowledged, creating a gap between the internal understanding of what had been achieved and the external narrative presented to the American public, which initially received only vague reports of an air attack on Japan without details of how it had been carried out. This ambiguity extended to the crews who had landed in the Soviet Union, whose internment reflected the complex neutrality agreements governing Soviet-Japanese relations at the time. and whose prolonged absence added another layer of uncertainty to an operation already marked by dispersion and delay, illustrating how geopolitical considerations could shape the outcomes of even a tightly focused military action. As weeks passed, fragments of the raid's story began to coalesce, with reports confirming that most crews had survived, that targets had been struck as planned, and that Japanese defenses had been caught off guard, reinforcing the view within American leadership that the decision to launch early, despite the increased risk, had been justified. Yet this conclusion remained provisional because the full Japanese response had not yet played out, and because the carriers that had enabled the raid were already being repositioned for the next phase of the war, their availability and readiness directly affected by the choices made in April. USS Hornet, having delivered the bombers, would soon find herself engaged in operations far more intense and sustained, while USS Enterprise, already hardened by earlier engagements, would continue to serve as a central pillar of American carrier strength. And the experience gained during the raid in navigation, coordination, and decision-making under uncertainty would inform subsequent operations in ways that were not always visible but were nonetheless significant. At the same time, Japanese naval aviation and air defense units undertook their own reviews, seeking to understand how American bombers had approached undetected and what measures could prevent a recurrence, leading to changes in patrol patterns, radar deployment, and readiness that increased the complexity of future American operations, but also consumed resources and attention that might otherwise have been directed elsewhere. For the men who had flown the raid, those who eventually returned to American lines carried with them a perspective shaped by extreme isolation and improvisation, having experienced the limits of planning when confronted with weather, terrain, and enemy action, and their accounts, once debriefed, fed into a growing institutional understanding of how air power could be projected in unconventional ways, even as they underscored the fragility of such efforts when margins were thin and assumptions incomplete. As spring turned into early summer, the raid receded from the headlines, but not from strategic calculations, because its influence persisted in the movements of fleets, the allocation of aircraft, and the mindset of commanders on both sides, all of whom were now acutely aware that surprise could flow in either direction, and that decisions made with imperfect information could produce consequences far beyond their immediate scope. Within the American Pacific Command, this awareness translated into an increased emphasis on intelligence, reconnaissance, and the careful husbanding of carrier forces, lessons reinforced by the knowledge that the early launch of the Doolittle raid, while successful, had brought the task force perilously close to detection and potential destruction, a reminder that boldness carried costs that could not always be absorbed. Yet even as caution and calculation reasserted themselves, the underlying tension remained unresolved, because the raid had demonstrated both the power and the vulnerability of carrier-based operations, highlighting a paradox that would define much of the Pacific War.
Where decisive actions often depended on committing irreplaceable assets under conditions of uncertainty with outcomes that could not be fully controlled, this tension was about to intensify dramatically as Japanese plans to eliminate the American carrier threat moved toward execution, and as U.S. commanders, informed in part by the ripple effects of the April strike, prepared to meet that challenge with forces stretched thin and intelligence still incomplete, setting the stage for a confrontation in which the balance between risk and reward would again be tested under circumstances even more unforgiving, and where the consequences of failure would be immediate and potentially irreversible, leaving little room for error as both sides edged closer to a decisive encounter whose shadow was already falling across the Pacific.
That shadow lengthened rapidly as Japanese operational planning accelerated, because the shock of the April strike hardened Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's resolve to force a decisive battle.
and by late May 1942, the Japanese combined fleet was already moving to execute a complex operation aimed at Midway Atoll, an operation shaped directly by the realization that American carriers could appear unexpectedly and strike at the heart of Japan. And although this confrontation lay geographically far from the Doolittle raid's bombing runs, it was causally linked, the raid having reinforced Japanese assumptions that the U.S. carrier force must be drawn out and destroyed before it could repeat such an intrusion. On the American side, signals intelligence began to reveal fragments of Japanese intent, yet those fragments were incomplete, contested, and surrounded by uncertainty, creating a situation in which commanders had to decide how much confidence to place in decrypted communications and how much risk to accept in positioning their limited carrier strength, a problem that echoed the dilemmas faced in April, but now carried even higher stakes, because the loss of carriers would not merely blunt a symbolic strike, but could determine control of the Pacific. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, veterans of the April mission, were central to this planning, their crews still absorbing lessons from the raid, even as they prepared for another confrontation that would demand endurance, precision, and disciplined restraint. While USS Yorktown, damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea earlier in May, was rushed through repairs at Pearl Harbor in an effort that stretched dockyard capacity and tested assumptions about what was technically possible under time pressure, reflecting again the pattern established by the Doolittle raid.
Where calculated risk was accepted as the price of seizing opportunity, the men who had launched the April bombers were not present in the same form. Yet the memory of that mission lingered in wardrooms and planning rooms, reinforcing the idea that Japanese reactions could be intense, but not always immediate or perfectly coordinated, a belief that encouraged American commanders to trust their intelligence assessments even when those assessments contradicted conventional expectations. As early June approached, the operational environment became increasingly strained, with long hours on watch, repeated drills, and the psychological weight of knowing that this next engagement would not permit the kind of withdrawal available to Task Force 16 after the raid, because both sides were now deliberately seeking contact, each hoping to strike first under conditions of surprise. On June 4, as Japanese carrier aircraft struck Midway itself, American carrier task forces maneuvered to launch their own attacks. And here the legacy of the April operation manifested not in tactics, but in mindset.
A willingness to launch strikes under conditions that were far from ideal, with incomplete situational awareness, scattered formations, and limited escort, because delay risked losing the initiative entirely. American torpedo squadrons attacked first, flying into heavy opposition, their losses severe, yet their actions drew Japanese fighters down and disrupted defensive patterns, setting conditions that would later allow dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown to achieve decisive results, a sequence of events often described as fortunate but rooted in the same acceptance of uncertainty that had governed earlier decisions, including the choice to launch B-25s from Hornet far earlier than planned. While Midway unfolded as a dramatic and concentrated battle, its connection to the Doolittle raid remained indirect yet persistent because Japanese dispersion of forces, driven in part by fear of further strikes on the home islands, diluted their strength at the critical point, and because the American emphasis on protecting and exploiting carrier mobility reflected lessons learned from having exposed those same carriers during the April mission. As the smoke cleared over Midway and the balance of carrier power shifted decisively in favor of the United States, the raid's influence became clearer in retrospect, though it remained difficult to quantify precisely, reinforcing the idea that strategic effects often emerged from chains of causation rather than single decisive acts. Yet for the individuals involved, particularly those connected to the raid itself, the period following Midway did not bring immediate resolution because several of the Doolittle raiders remained missing or captive.
And the full human cost of the operation continued to surface through intelligence reports and prisoner accounts, revealing harsh treatment and executions that underscored the risks taken not only by the air crews but by civilians who had assisted them. These revelations complicated the narrative of success, introducing a sobering counterpoint to celebrations of Midway and raising questions within the American command about the ethical and strategic dimensions of unconventional strikes, questions that did not yield simple answers and were often subsumed by the urgent demands of ongoing operations. As the Pacific War expanded through the summer and fall of 1942, with battles at Guadalcanal and beyond, the memory of the April strike receded further into the background, yet its core lesson persisted: that the United States would repeatedly face moments where action had to be taken with incomplete information, under time pressure, and with assets that could not easily be replaced, moments where hesitation carried its own dangers. The Doolittle raid thus became less a singular event and more a reference point, a reminder of how initiative could disrupt enemy planning while simultaneously exposing American forces to significant risk, a duality that defined carrier warfare throughout the conflict. For the surviving raiders who returned to duty and for the naval aviators who continued to launch from decks that pitched and rolled under fire, the experience reinforced a professional ethos grounded not in certainty or bravado, but in preparation and acceptance of contingency.
An understanding that even the most carefully constructed plan could unravel under the influence of weather, chance encounters, or enemy action, yet still had to be executed decisively. By late 1942 and early 1943, as American industrial output began to shift the material balance decisively, the strategic environment changed, reducing the relative risk of bold operations. But during the early months of the war, including April 1942, such operations had been undertaken when margins were razor-thin, a fact that lent the Doolittle raid a lasting significance beyond its immediate effects. However, even with hindsight, the raid resisted simple classification as either gamble or inevitability, because its success depended on a chain of favorable outcomes that could easily have broken at multiple points, from the early detection by a Japanese picket boat to the weather over China, and the reality that those outcomes did not break masked how close the mission came to failure. This proximity to failure, rather than the bombs themselves, formed the true core of the raid's historical importance, illustrating how decisions made under extreme uncertainty could shape not only immediate results, but the trajectory of an entire theater of war. And as American commanders moved forward into new operations, carrying the weight of these experiences, the unresolved tension between boldness and caution remained, setting up future moments where that balance would again be tested, sometimes with consequences that could not be undone, and where the lessons of April 1942 would be implicitly invoked, even when the raid itself was no longer mentioned, leaving the story poised at the edge of its final reckoning, where outcomes would finally be measured not by intent or symbolism, but by documented result and lasting change.
That reckoning unfolded not as a single dramatic revelation, but as a gradual accumulation of outcomes that, taken together, fixed the Doolittle raid into the historical record with clarity that had been absent in April, because by mid and late 1942, the fates of nearly all participants were known, the operational consequences had manifested, and the raid's place within the broader Pacific War could finally be assessed with evidence rather than expectation.
Of the 16 aircraft launched from USS Hornet, 15 had reached targets over Japan, 1 had diverted to the Soviet Union, and although every bomber had been lost as an aircraft, the majority of the crews survived, an outcome that exceeded the quiet hopes of planners who had understood from the beginning that recovery was the weakest link in the operation. And as American intelligence confirmed rescues carried out by Chinese forces, debriefings began to assemble a factual account of the mission's execution, revealing consistent navigation challenges, fuel shortages, and weather difficulties that validated concerns raised during planning, but had been impossible to resolve once the early launch was ordered. The loss of several airmen to Japanese captivity and the later confirmation that some had been executed after trial added a permanent gravity to the raid's legacy, anchoring it not only in strategic analysis but in human consequence. And while these facts were handled with discretion during the war itself, they shaped internal assessments and reinforced the understanding that unconventional strikes carried costs that extended far beyond the moment of impact. Within the U.S. military, the raid's immediate operational value was never overstated because the bomb damage inflicted on Japanese cities was modest and did not significantly degrade industrial output or military capability, yet its strategic and psychological effects were increasingly recognized as real and consequential,
particularly in how it influenced Japanese deployment decisions, air defense priorities, and perceptions of vulnerability, all of which consumed attention and resources during a critical phase of the war. Admiral Yamamoto's determination to eliminate the American carrier threat, sharpened by the embarrassment of the April strike, contributed to the operational urgency that characterized Japanese planning for Midway. And although Midway's outcome cannot be attributed to any single cause, the raid formed part of the context that shaped Japanese assumptions and risk tolerance, just as it shaped American confidence in carrier mobility and long-range strike potential. For the United States, the raid provided an early demonstration of joint cooperation between the Navy and Army Air Forces under combat conditions, a relationship that would expand rapidly as the war progressed. And the technical lessons learned from launching medium bombers at sea, while not repeated on the same scale, informed thinking about aircraft handling, deck operations, and the limits of carrier flexibility. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle himself became a symbol of the operation, though within professional circles his role was understood less as that of a lone figure and more as that of a coordinator who executed orders within a framework defined by higher command, weather, chance, and the disciplined performance of crews whose success depended on preparation rather than improvisation alone. As the Pacific War moved into 1943 and 1944, the scale of American operations expanded dramatically, dwarfing the April 1942 raid in terms of aircraft numbers, tonnage dropped, and sustained pressure. Yet the raid retained a distinct identity because it occurred at a moment when such power did not yet exist, when risk tolerance was driven by necessity rather than abundance, and when the margin for error was so narrow that detection by a single enemy vessel could force an immediate, irreversible decision. Retrospectively, the choice to launch early, under extreme uncertainty, emerged as the raid's defining moment because it encapsulated the broader condition of the United States in early 1942, committed to action despite incomplete preparation, determined to seize initiative even when outcomes could not be guaranteed, and willing to accept losses that would later become avoidable as industrial strength and operational depth increased. By the time the full details of the raid were released to the American public, it had already achieved its intended morale effect, reinforcing confidence at home and among allied nations that Japan was not beyond reach, while internally it had provided a test case for decision-making under pressure that informed subsequent operations across the Pacific. In Japanese post-war analyses,
The raid appeared as an early indicator of strategic overextension and defensive vulnerability, a warning that was recognized but not fully mitigated before larger disasters unfolded, underscoring how moments that seem small in isolation can carry disproportionate significance when they intersect with flawed assumptions and compressed timelines. For the men who flew from Hornet's deck that morning in April, the raid remained a singular experience, defined less by the act of bombing than by the long sequence of uncertainty that followed. The nights without fuel guarantees, the reliance on strangers for survival, and the knowledge that their mission's value would be measured over months and years rather than minutes. When historians later placed the Doolittle raid within the arc of the Pacific War, they did so not as a turning point in isolation, but as an early inflection, a demonstration of reach and resolve that preceded and subtly shaped more decisive engagements, and as an example of how limited means could be employed to achieve effects that exceeded their immediate scale. The carriers that had launched the raid continued to fight.
USS Hornet ultimately lost at Santa Cruz, USS Enterprise surviving to become the most decorated U.S. ship of the war, their trajectories reflecting the broader cost of carrier warfare in which early boldness gradually gave way to sustained dominance. By anchoring the raid in documented outcomes rather than myth, its historical meaning settled into focus as an operation that succeeded not because it was free of risk, but because risk was accepted knowingly at a time when alternatives were few, and because execution under pressure remained disciplined even as plans unraveled. In that sense, the strike launched under extreme uncertainty ended not with a single decisive moment, but with a lasting alteration in perception on both sides of the Pacific, closing one chapter of improvisation and opening another defined increasingly by scale, coordination, and accumulating advantage as the war moved forward, carrying with it the imprint of April 1942, fixed now as a completed event, measured by evidence, consequence, and the enduring record of what was done when certainty was unavailable.